Hello, everyone. We are back after a short break, and we are also very much welcoming our first keynote speaker of PostSensorium conference. And Christiane Paul, hello.
Hi.
And I will just do a short introduction. Christiane Paul is a professor of media studies at the New School and adjunct curator of digital art at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York City. Christiane Paul is well known as the author of the book Digital Art. The first edition was in 2003, and then later 4 more and many translations. So which is particularly important because here are also many students in audience. And also Christiane Paul is, among her more recent projects, she's curator of the question of intelligence, AI, and the future of humanity, 2020. And I would like to welcome and to give you a floor on your art and AI, automating the sensorium.
Thanks so much for the generous introduction, Raza, and thanks to all the presenters this morning for their excellent presentations. I'm switching to screen sharing, and hopefully you can see the screen at this point. So I would like to build on what has been discussed this morning, focusing a little bit more on AI and the automation of the sensorium. Obviously, I could talk about this for the rest of the day, so advance apologies for covering only a certain kind of spectrum of the conversation here and of projects. There would be many, many more, and I will also try to leave enough room for a conversation to cover other aspects. So as we have seen this morning, the PostSensorium is a very, very broad field, and there are many facets of it to cover. And I am always a little bit skeptical of the term post, whether it's the post-sensorium or the post-digital, because it is complicated in terms of the temporalities it sets up. We're by no means after the sensorium, but we are living in a time where a lot of the sensorium is outsourced to applications, whether that is software that reads us within cities to supposedly protect us and provide security, whether those are applications that are talking to elderly or self-driving cars. A lot of our senses and of our sensorium is relegated to software. I also want to briefly touch upon robotics. In pop culture, artificial intelligence is mostly associated with robotics and our robotic overlords. Technically, of course, there's a difference between robotics and AI, although artificially intelligent robots also play a major role in our society, from warfare to other services. So I think this is just an important distinction we have to make. I want to return to Raza's comment that what we feel ultimately also determines what we think. So the sensorium is inextricably linked to intelligence. And Alan Turing very wisely early on posed the question, may not machines carry out something which ought to be described as thinking, but is very different from the thinking that a man does. And the Turing test itself already partly got to that question. So perhaps our question of can machines think also has to be reconsidered, making this distinction. Andrew Guffey in Intelligence has also pointed out that the Turing test and the Turing machine are just indicative of how we have configured machine intelligence as a form of imitation. And this becomes very obvious in art projects that are based on AI. A lot of them are playing the imitation game, which is also good in the sense of testing the imagination, as some of the speakers this morning have pointed out. So Goffey also says that for all its sophistication, this demystifying critique can very easily fail to make an imaginative leap outside of anthropocentric and human-centered thinking, and can fall into the trap that we kind of start seeing artificial intelligence in terms of the production of discursive rules or of networks of text, and then end up saying, oh yeah, but it is nothing but a textual construction or discursive. So we also have to free ourselves from kind of limiting thinkings about AI and how we configure it. And unfortunately, my screen doesn't seem to move. Hopefully, I will be able to access the next slide shortly, or I have to stop screen sharing and jump in again. My apologies, but this seems to be something that happens quite a bit due to the recordings, I think. I don't know if anyone can assist, but I am frozen right now.
So you cannot stop sharing?
I cannot stop sharing either, no. I have lost, unfortunately, control over. Here we go. So hopefully there isn't too much of a delay. So I also wanted to quickly point out that there's a long history of AI being the next big thing. Obviously, it came into being, or really was formalized within the 1950s and 60s. And since then, we have seen a couple of AI winters already, and we are now entering AI summer again, so to speak, because in the past few years, we have seen a lot of activities. And once again, I apologize, I'm a little bit stuck here. Hopefully that will change in a...
Christiane, maybe I can stop you by taking over, and you could share again.
Yes, that would be wonderful if you could get me out of the screen sharing mode. Okay, perfect. So let me try this again. I have had this problem, and it seems to be related to recordings. All right. So once again, these ups and downs and winters and summers are also very much connected to technology expectations. We see this, as this graph shows, in terms of all technologies, basically moving from triggers and inflated expectations to a plateau of productivity. What I also find interesting is that the AI winters always seem to have coincided, at least a little bit, with human-computer interface summers. So we have a correlation between the two and seem to focus on different parts of the technology. When it comes to art and experimentation of art projects with AI, we really have to look at the field of artificial intelligence itself. I could talk about this diagram for the rest of the session and don't have time to do that. But in terms of artistic experimentation, it is very important to keep in mind that we have seen a move from more symbolic AI, so basically expert systems and also fuzzy systems that replicate procedures of logic, to a more statistical approach. And the machine learning we're experiencing right now is largely based on that, with a little bit of overlap to the sub-symbolic through neural networks and deep learning and effective computing and autonomous systems. So artistic practice in the field takes place within this range. As has already been pointed out in the earlier session, machine learning as we are experiencing it today would not be possible without big data and without the learning and data mining of it. And I think it is helpful to return at this point to the provocations for big data that Dana Boyd and Kate Crawford formulated quite some time ago. And keep in mind that automating research always changes the definition of knowledge, that claims to objectivity and accuracy are misleading because data sets from the start are biased. Bigger data is not always better data. Sometimes it makes sense to work with small data sets, and not all data sets are equivalent. And then, of course, ethics have become a huge topic in machine learning. Just because the data is accessible doesn't make it ethical to use it. And the limited access to big data creates new digital divides. These are all problems that are inscribed into AI and machine learning as we're experiencing it today. So when it comes to automating the sensorium, we are encountering this every day through our phones, through many applications we are using in terms of vision, speech, language, and ultimately the production of knowledge. Obviously, I'm also leaving out a few senses, taste and smell, and there are also artworks getting to that, but I'm neglecting them for now. So in terms of vision, we are looking at everything from object scene and activity detection to face recognition and identification, emotion recognition. In speech, we have the speech to text and text to speech synthesis, real-time translation, speaker identification. And all of this then through language also ends up with customized personalized learning procedures. And I think it has to be very clear that through this automation and outsourcing of our sensorium, we're effectively changing what knowledge is and what knowledge can be. So that's important to keep in mind. I also, as a background, want to mention all of the exhibitions that have happened since 2017 mostly, on artificial intelligence, art and artificial intelligence. So we're definitely in a new AI summer also when it comes to AI in art. Yeah. So from early exhibitions at Ars Electronica to AI More Than Human at the Barbican in London in 2019. And then last year in particular, Manual Override at the Shed, in real life at in the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago, and Ganland at Damm Gallery in Berlin. I also want to highlight that some of these exhibitions have focused on the uncanny. So, for example, Uncanny Values, Artificial Intelligence and You at the Museum of Applied Arts in Vienna, and then Claudia Schmuckli's show in California, Uncanny Valley Being Human in the Age of AI. So while there has been a lot of overlap between projects, there also have been certain trends in approaching this subject. As Raza mentioned, I curated an exhibition called The Question of Intelligence, AI and the Future of Humanity for the Sheila C. Johnson Design Center at the New School in 2020. It was cut short a little bit by COVID. And this exhibition really focused on the automation of our senses, but also extrapolated from that and thought about what this means for creativity, for labor, and for the environment. In terms of this talk, I will cut out some sections of it and also mention a lot of related projects that weren't included in this show, since the issues of labor and the environment, while very important, are not that connected to the automation of the sensorium, but perhaps we can get to that a little bit more in our conversation that follows. I just wanted to show you some views of the exhibition so that you get a sense of how it looked in physical space. And I will dive into some of the projects a little bit later. So you see an environment here covered. So a view of some of the pieces that I will skip, such as Larbit Sisters, Bitsoil, Pop-Up Text, and Hack Campaign, or the Truckers project that you see to the right. These are more connected to labor. And there also was the Alpha Garden Collective's project on a robotic garden led by Ken Goldberg, and kind of got a continuation of his early project Telegarden. So all of those are more related to labor and the environment, which we have seen covered a little bit more this morning, rather than automating the sensorium. So I'll skip these. There were a few projects that explored vision. In particular, you may be familiar with Memo Acton's ongoing series, Learning to See, in which neural networks are fed with data sets that are roughly configured around nature and the environment, from fire and flowers to the Hubble Space Telescope. So what you see in this interactive installation is a pedestal with objects on it that you can configure. And then you are watching the neural network trying to understand what it is seeing based on the data set it has been fed. This leads to very interesting and poetic kinds of configurations, but also nicely highlights the limitation of what AIs can see based on the data they have been set. So this process of learning to see and being able to see through the eyes of an AI is what is very important here and poetically brought to the fore in this project. A few other pieces in the show really focused on aspects of bias. So Mimi Onuoha's As Aggregated 2.0, for example, used Google's reverse image algorithm and tested its limitations. So what Mimi did in this project was feed an image of her mother to the system. So you see that at the center of it, and then framed this aggregated arrangement of us, or kind of speculative us, that the software arrives at around this. And what you can tell if you dive into this a little bit more is really huge gaps in understanding issues of ethnicity, of class, and of family in this software. Obviously, these algorithms also have evolved since the project has been done, but these are still biases and kind of predilections of the software that we're really facing in this. And it seems like I'm stuck again. I seem to be able to only make it through a few slides. So if you could help again, Raza, that would be much appreciated while I keep talking. Yeah. And already start with the next project. So this kind of conversation was also continued by Lior Salmanson in another type of work that focused more on the history. So in this case, he looked at the automated image recognition algorithm, AAT, which was specifically developed as a tool for the blind and sight impaired. So what Lior did in this project was feed iconic historical photographs to the system, and then see how it classified them and came up with related images. And all of these images are combined into a lenticular print. So as you are moving in front of these images, you can see different facets of what the software came up with. And what you see at the bottom of the caption is what the software attached to the image, how it tagged it. So in this case, in the case of what you're looking at, which was this famous image of Martin Luther King addressing the crowd, it was one person standing, sky, crowd. And the related imagery that the software comes up with here range from a Trump rally to an LGBTQ rights march. So what you see here is a collapsing of history. The same thing happening here on the left when it comes to civil rights marches, and on the right to the Kennedy assassination, which is combined with images from a racetrack. So what this project points to is really the flattening of historical connections in this process of automated seeing. I'm moving on to automated speech, and I also want to cover some historical projects such as Lynn Hirschman-Leeson's Agent Ruby, an early chatbot from 1998 that she developed in connection with her film Techno-Lust that was released in 2002, where Tilda Swinton plays Ruby and different manifestations of her. So what you see in this online project is also Tilda Swinton's face that continuously changes its expression. So you could interact with Ruby, who had a seeded personality, but then also learned. And this project was commissioned and is in the collection of SF MoMA. And over 13 years, Ruby has had an enormous amount of conversations with people. So this project more lately also has been exhibited with binders containing all of these conversations. So here we have something interesting in that we are looking at the life of conversations of an AI. And once again, this is a work that in very interesting ways addresses the evolution of a personality and bot over time through a process of learning. A very different take on this is Stephanie Dinkins, not the only one, and two, where Stephanie in a sculptural work really seeds a database that is very decidedly a limited set of data and focuses just on one family that has lived through different generations, from grandmother to daughter to niece, and experienced different kinds of contexts for the understanding of race. And it is very interesting to see and interact with this work, which in its cultural form also kind of suggests an ear that you speak into. The conversations can be nonsensical, but at some points also get to very, very interesting personal experiences that we're encountering. And this kind of personal connection to a data set that is very much underrepresented in artificial intelligence in general tells us what AIs that are not basically pragmatic and functional like Siri and Alexa and what we interact with could have to offer us, and basically the advantages of limited data sets. So here are a few more views of N2 and a very different experience of a data set, I think. I want to mention a related work here that many of you may be familiar with, Stephanie Dinkins' Conversations with Bina 48. And I think this work in particular cuts to the core of the PostSensorium. Bina 48 has been much hyped as the most advanced social robot. It was created by the TerraSem Foundation in connection with and collaboration with Hanson Robotics. So Martin Rothblatt, the founder of TerraSem, was approached by Hanson Robotics about creating this kind of robot and decided to mirror it on her wife, Bina. So what we have here is a robot that is basically, and AI that is basically a replica of a living person. It is a Black person that is supposed to be learning from conversations with others and has been seeded with thoughts and ideas from Bina. But of course, you immediately run into a lot of interesting and very problematic questions. What exactly is this Black social robot and intelligence learning from online massively white data sets? How can this robot situate itself within the history of racism, for example? So Stephanie Dinkins has made a point of visiting Bina and having conversations with her. It's an ongoing performative project. I'm going to play a very short clip, if it plays.
Do you know racism?
Well, I actually didn't have it. It was after that.
So I'll cut it here rather than playing the whole clip. And as you have heard, what the response is, I didn't have it. Racism starts to sound like a disease, and Bina kind of dodges the question. So that whole contextual understanding is once again missing from this AI, which raises a lot of questions about the sensorium in its relationship to intelligence. So moving on, I want to highlight another historical project by David Rokeby, The Giver of Names, which was already done in 1990, but I believe has aged very well. And this project really combines vision with speech and text and processing. So how the project works, if you haven't encountered it in person, you see this kind of pile of objects on the floor. You pick up one of them, put it on a pedestal. Then the system performs image recognition, and you can follow through a continuous process of abstraction from vision to speech. So the system translates the image into connected words and then draws from a lexical database that starts riffing off of it. David originally configured this or thought of it also as a software for writers to overcome writer's block, and come up with aesthetic statements. And you can really see here perception in its stages of abstraction as it is processed by a machinic system. Of course, AI today is more advanced and than this, but I think what this project still very nicely does is also reveal the mechanics of perception in this particular process. And here, another image of the installation. And I want to now move on to connecting AI a little bit more to what creativity of the PostSensorium means. So many art projects over the past decades actually have tried to construct or imagine AIs that would be artists and that would transcend us in their imagination. I think this is both a problematic and very interesting premise, as some of the speakers this morning have pointed out. We need this kind of imaginative probing, but we also have to consider it within the awareness of what we are seeding AIs with, and overblown expectations of AIs coming up with completely new visions and things we have never seen before, while we are basing them on what we basically, on our history and what we have been feeding them. So one of the projects that was included in the question of intelligence was AI Mapamundi. an interactive artistic mind map with artificial imagination that was developed by a whole team of artists and scientists from China. So this is voice driven. As you saw, there is a microphone in front of it. You're speaking into the system. And this interactive AI painting system that has been trained to create these associative drawings and maps that are reminiscent of the Hereford Mappa Mundi, one of the famous medieval maps of the world, connects drawings to lexical and semantic connections, but it has also been seeded with a dose of absurdist dadaism. By now, we're quite familiar with these kind of lexical maps, but this one is very interesting in terms of the poetic connections it sometimes makes between a kid and a toy gun, for example, and writing, code, copywriting, and office buildings. So it really provides a new way of looking at this, and what AI could imagine, or what an AI imagination could look like, was very much at the core of this particular work. So here, another view of it with the microphone highlighted a little bit more. I just wanted to mention that in terms of the exhibition installation, it was very interesting that David Rokeby's piece also has sound, so that AI is reading out its poetry and its sentences aloud. And that as ambient noise kind of fed into this system. So what AI Mappa Mundi was doing inadvertently when nobody was talking to it was riffing off of David Rokeby's The Giver of Names, which created some kind of interesting confusion. It would be a major omission if we aren't considering Harold Cohen's Aaron in this context. So Aaron being known as the first artificial intelligence drawing software that he started creating at the University of California in San Diego in the late 1960s. It has gone through various manifestations. You here see a screen-based, more abstract version that was included in the exhibition, but the work has been shown throughout the decades in very different forms. It was first more representational. Then you see on the right an installation of it at SF MoMA in 1979. And what Harold Cohen tried to explore from the very start here was how AIs can collaborate with humans. So this was not a drawing system that was conceived to come up with amazing things on its own, but he really saw it as a collaboration. And of course, there have been many robotic drawing systems, AI-based, that have been done since then. So at this point, I want to dive into the area of generative adversarial networks, GANs. I think within recent years, most of the experimentation in art that we have seen has focused on GANs and this type of machine learning, which I often think of it as a kind of modified Turing test, since you're seeding the GAN with a training set of images and then tasking it with a goal, and the generator constantly has to work against the discriminator that kind of evaluates it in terms of being real or fake. So this is also an interesting automation of a kind of Turing test. Once again, this has been used for creating movies, for creating paintings, etc. The work that was included in the question of intelligence was Mary Flanagan's Grace AI. And Mary created a kind of setup that also involved countering biases in data sets. So Grace AI was fed only with paintings or images of paintings by women. So here we are creating a feminist bias within an AI. And this is truly something unique in the sense that this would be hard to replicate in the real world. So this is an AI that only understands the world through paintings by women. And Mary ran into issues with data sets here because many museums apparently do not even classify their collection by male versus female artists. What Mary then tasked this AI with was to create or draw images of Frankenstein, going back to Mary Shelley's feminist critique of male-dominated creation. So what you see here are several instances of Gray's AI's attempts to create paintings of Frankenstein, accompanied by a book in which the AI reflects on its process. Yeah. And I want to mention here at least one of the works that has gained a lot of attention in this context because it was auctioned at Christie's for more than 400,000, the portrait of Edmond Bellamy, created by the French collective Obvious. And I want to mention this as an example of all of those AIs that basically try to imitate once again and replicate what humans have already done before. And to me, without dismissing these projects as an interesting experiment, it is kind of notable that we should ask the question, why do we want AIs to replicate what humans have already done very well? Yeah. And is this the most productive way of approaching it? So once again, here, this process of selection to processing of again, and this is also a training process and creation process that we need to investigate. Yeah. And a few more examples of this whole family of the Bellamys in this process. I want to move towards the experimentation with storytelling in this process without going into too much detail. You may be familiar with Ian Cheng's Emissary trilogy, which is based on simulation software that in this fictitious universe that Ian Cheng creates within this trilogy probes the evolution of a civilization that in the end becomes governed by an AI. One of the central characters in this narrative is Sheba the dog, and there are also AR components to the work. So the Emissary trilogy was mostly image-based. Here, a little bit of a background in terms of what this system looks like. And how it is constructing its narrative that you see evolving on the screen. So this is presented in museum spaces as a video projection. And as you are watching, you are also kind of trying to make sense of the rule sets and of the evolution of this AI-driven world. So this a very interesting experiment with the evolution of this abstract civilization constructed within the project. Ian Cheng then did a work in 2018 to 19 called Bob, Bag of Beliefs. And Bob is an AI that is continuously being trained by the input of visitors and an online community, and tries to master the tasks of life in different forms, dies many deaths in the process, since it fails often at trying to perform tasks that we as humans perform on a daily basis. And I wanted to focus a little bit more on the most recent manifestation of Cheng's work, Life After Bob, which just launched at the Shed in New York. So this is a continuation of the work, but taking it to the next level as an episodic anime series that imagines a future world in which our minds are co-inhabited by AI entities on the level of the story. This is basically a father running an experiment with his daughter Chalice, who becomes inhabited by different forms of Bob. And in the end, he starts preferring the Bob part of his daughter to his real life daughter. So here we are facing the scenario of being replaced by AIs after coexisting with them. And you could say that on a less imaginative level, this is really something that we have to deal with in the future. So Ian Cheng interestingly combines this with a more linear type of narrative and rendition of the story, and in the exhibition space, a separate stage where you, through a wiki, can also interact with the system and make contributions to it that constantly change it in the process. I want to end with a few thoughts on what all of this means for art and the art world, because we also recently have seen a lot more focus on and exploration of automated curation and what that means for art and the art world, prompted by the infiltration of all kinds of sectors by AI. The Museums and AI Network has been formed, developing conversations around AI ethics and museums. So this really a network or organization that probes, I think, very, very important issues surrounding that, not necessarily in the sense of AIs taking over as curators, although I will show you some examples of that in the following two, but also probing the automation of image collection images, for example, and what is being served to the public as a consequence. We have also seen in this context experimentation with chatbots embodying museum personalities, Iris Plus being an example of that. So this is a bot that the Museum of Tomorrow in Brazil experimented with. Once again, I think it's really important and worth it to take this imaginative leap, but we also should rein in our expectations when it comes to capturing the personality of a museum through an AI. As you may know, the curator of the Bucharest Biennial will be an artificial intelligence. What you're seeing here are not images of Jarvis, the curator, but just images the press used in absence of that artificial curator to kind of embody it, which also tells you something, about perceptions of AI. Once again, I think we have to limit our expectations because Jarvis will be seeded with previous curation data sets. So by definition, this AI can only come up with what variations on what human curators have already done in the process. And I want to end it with some reflections on a project that we commissioned for the Whitney Museum's Artport site. The next biennial should be curated by a machine, a collaborative project by Übermorgen, Leonardo Impad, and Joasha Kriza. So this being an AI that was done as a co-commission by Liverpool Biennial and the Whitney Museum, and the AI was seeded with the data sets of Whitney Biennials and Liverpool Biennial and tasked with curating its own biennials, basically. So the idea here from the start was not primarily to see the amazing results that this AI would come up with, but to really also probe into our curatorial desires, and how an AI could reflect what human curators have been maybe privileging or emphasizing or have been focusing on. So when you open the interface, this is what you first encounter, and I'll show it to you in action a little bit more in a moment. Just wanted to orient you. One more bit of information. We decided from the start to focus on textual rather than image curation, because we felt that we could get more in-depth result on that basis rather than curated shows that are focused on images by artists or modifications thereof. So once you open up the interface, you see these little wheels populating the image of a kind of universe. So each of these white wheels basically exemplifies a different kind of universe that this AI has generated. And in each of these universes, you will find artist bios, you will find curatorial statements and press releases and reviews constructed by this AI that constantly writes and rewrites itself. Clicking on the red wheels will give you a little bit more information about the project, FAQ and list. And here you basically get the bios, but you can nicely see how this AI constantly writes and rewrites itself. And by clicking on the next button to the right, you will then basically enter different kinds of universes. I also want to mention that each universe is accompanied by a TikTok playlist, which you can turn off. This another tongue-in-cheek kind of intervention that points to the automation, of the Sensorium. What you're seeing here are artist bios that are written out. All of them are obviously based on real biographies of artists. In some universes, they are constructing bios with artists with the same first name or same last name. And in others, they're switching it up. So here you can see the reviews that are being written by the AI and also the releases. So Whitney Biennial 2020 will be the first in a new series that will see present-day practitioners engage with and reflect on spooky, unorthodox, and experimental entertainment beyond the art object. And of course, you can open up very different universes and kind of compare the construction of this. A little bit of insider information. So interesting things that happened during this process was that Leonardo Impet came back to us with the early tests and said, look, I don't quite like the results of what the AI is producing because the language is so academic and so dry. So it was interesting to see that what the AI originally produced was really a reflection of our academic discourse. And we had meetings about what to feed it in order to counteract this problem. And we ended up feeding it data sets from Rolling Stone magazine, for example, just to make the language a little bit juicier. So this just as a very rough overview and investigation of art and AI as it automates our senses, as it affects creativity, and also affects curation. And I hope we can talk about this a little bit more in our conversation. Thanks so much. And I think you have to, once again, stop sharing with me.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Christiane, for this amazing presentation. I think, yeah, I have written down many questions. So there are also some in the chat, but maybe some wants to just join in now live because we have quite like time, like 25 minutes or 20 minutes.
My question has to do with programming languages and how they can be adapted to be more inclusive, so that training AI can also be more inclusive. And I'm thinking specifically of work I've done with First Nations groups in Canada, and the lack of resources for ethno-programming. And they see it as being an issue of decolonization. They really want to be able to be programming for themselves, but a lot of Indigenous languages tend to use symbols that can't be accommodated by the established programming languages. So does that mean that their work in AI and their work with AI and tech and artistic productions are going to be limited until there's a solution for the programming issue and the programming language issues? Or do you see a way around that?
Thanks so much for raising this very important point, because languages themselves are not something that I touched upon in this. And yeah, I'm afraid we really have to think about the coding of the languages themselves. The important point you are making here is that we're looking at two-pronged challenges. It's not only that certain data sets are underrepresented, but that programming languages do not necessarily accommodate the breadth of symbolism and language. So we're looking at data sets and contexts and the languages themselves. And I think this decolonizing of languages has become an aspect that is right now more and more explored by working groups, and it's very important work that needs to be done. I don't think there's a workaround. I'm afraid, we really have to address the issue at the core. I guess there could be workarounds through the data set itself, but it's complicated.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm so happy that people are starting to recognize this kind of issue with language and the limitations of programming to accommodate.
Yeah, luckily, I even have students who are thinking about the recoding of that. So hopefully there's a whole next generation that will address this full force.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Sabrina, for very interesting and important question. Anybody else would like to? Please write in a chat also while we are talking, because while I will be asking, so I would like them to suggest that you think and write down the questions. So one of the questions which I really like, I would like to kind of go back to the beginning of presentation. So about the Turing's question, can machines think? Or rephrasing with PostSensorium, can machines feel? So and if you look at this, the ending part, so again these machines keep thinking, they are rephrasing how to make them feel. And this is and here is my question about the artists and scientists. So do you think scientists can also get some influence of the way how artists are trying to use recently, how artists try to make this two-directional connection between sensing and also algorithms, trying to kind of perceive more like surrounding, nature, especially. And do you think, like also in the works like what Hege was mentioning about her research about machines and empathy, and Maria, this sense work, like in earlier presentations. Yeah, so how do you think maybe this again is the time when artists can give some push, scientists are giving, there is demand out there, so that we want machines also to feel, and do you think artists can contribute?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, as many other people, I've been always advocating for closer art-science relationships. I don't want to instrumentalize art, but art can make a major a contribution and distribution when it comes to really probing certain kinds of issues. Science, in terms of its funding, even in more experimental R&D, very much can be limited by a focus on outcome and original setup. And art always has had a little bit more freedom in exploring questions. And I think so many of the works I have shown can also function as case studies for science. Leo Salmanson, for example, has had conversations with Google, of course, about his work. And I think it is helpful to do these kinds of tests. Then coming to your question about feeling, once again, I think we have to be very careful here. And we are still maybe a little bit too anthropocentric in the perception of it. What AI isn't at this point, largely, is embodied experience. So you raise the interesting question of what would be an AI that can feel in its own way. Maybe an AI that has the capacity of taste and smell and gathering its own kind of memories of environments and developing it. Well, there is always a human kind of seeding in terms of the coding of the process. This could lead to interesting results. But once again, I think we have to realize that this AI will not be based on our human sensorium. Coming back to Turing's question, can machines think? And maybe that's a different kind of thinking and intelligence. I would also argue that in all likelihood, it's a different kind of feeling. But this is an underexplored area. It's mostly, there has been a lot of emphasis on anthropomorphizing robots, showing empathy and connecting to people. But this experimentation with what can an AI feel and expanding the sensorium has not happened on a large scale.
Mm-hmm. I was maybe more referring also that it's possible through this coding, through symbols, maybe, but also referring to the first question by Sabrina. So maybe there is some other way that, not feeling, but through the other type of information, how to code symbols. Maybe then we can achieve a bit more broader perspective of this intelligent.
But once again, what I'm trying to get at is that we cannot equate that with what we understand as feeling or thinking, particularly if it's purely coded rather than based on sensual information.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Now there are many questions in. So first was by Heather. Please.
Hello.
Hi, Heather.
So in these discussions of automated creative processes, it reminds me of the surrealists, because I happen to be looking at the surrealists right now. And I think also in some of the accidental chance happenings and emergences, that's also like a very surrealist practice. And I'm wondering if there's any overlap or resonance or correspondence between some of the practices that the surrealists were using and describing, and why they were using all this automatic writing and stuff, and what current practitioners are doing with AI. Like, are they, is it there?
I think it is there, depends on the project, because thanks so much for pointing to that historical trajectory. There obviously are clear connections to the early practices of Dada and of surrealists in terms of developing randomized rule sets. They were largely randomized when it comes to the surrealists or Dada. The next stage was that those were encoded in Perl scripts, for example, and artists started experimenting with textual constructs. And I think even in AI now, many artists are very well aware of that area and also try to take it to the next level, because through coding, you can add a more generative process to that, because you might argue that the data set for Dadaism and Surrealism exists on one level. I showed the AI Mappamundi project, and that precisely tried to encode Dadaism a little bit more and insert it into this imagination. What I also liked about this work was that it deliberately kept it simple or imposed a lot of restrictions to really see what that impact might be. And I think, yeah, we just need to see more experimentation with that and how we can creatively expand that kind of vocabulary.
Okay, next question. Kat, Blair, please.
Hi. Can you see me? Okay, great. So thank you very much for your talk. It was fascinating. My question connects to the previous one really well. I was wondering about, you were talking about kind of using AI to replicate things we've already done. And one of the things that seems to be proposed for AI and creativity a lot is AI to kind of make happenstance and serendipitous connections that like maybe we wouldn't make or make more of them. And I was wondering if you had kind of like thoughts on that, or whether that is very much replicating the connections that we've already made. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think there's definitely a lot of potential in the more serendipitous connections that can be made here. I mean, ultimately, there always is that core of what we have seeded, but I think what AI can do, and maybe is better at, is ignoring part of our logic. Yeah, so there might be more interesting, nonsensical and very poetic connections that AI by nature comes up with. That's where I see the real potential of it, and where AI can exceed us, but that's coming from a very different direction than some of our aspirations for it, you know, in terms of blow our minds through exceeding human intelligence. Maybe the potential really lies in ignoring it in the first place. Yeah.
Thank you.
I also wanted to quickly, there was a question in the chat about clarifying the connection to robotics a little bit. Yeah. Coming back to the beginning of my presentation. So just to put that into perspective a little bit more, you can argue that robots by nature in their original definition are a mechanical construct. Obviously, the robots we encounter today are all equipped with AI in the sense of collision control, you know, in order to walk, in order to navigate environments, they all need artificial intelligence. So there is a whole spectrum. I showed this kind of diagram with an overlap between the two. So most of the robots we encounter today would have some AI just in order to move and get around. But we're continuously trying to expand that, you know, be it in drones and weaponry that is seeing and making decisions, etc. So this is really an area that is continuously expanding. What I wanted to counteract with this slide is a little bit is that many people, when you ask them what AI means, they start describing robots, and there are different fields. You may also recently have seen a lot of reporting in the press of the assassination of the Iranian nuclear scientist by Mossad, and the way AI was used in that process, you know, with a very elaborately constructed gun with AI that was fired remotely, compensating for a whole sensorial spectrum, basically sitting on a truck and having to compensate for the conditions of the road, the speed, and so many different factors. I mean, it's very scary, but also an outcome of AI and the post-sensorium that we will have to deal with in the future. And I'm very grateful to all the people who are working on really improving legislation in this field and area of autonomous weapon system.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So there are some more questions.
Okay, I guess I have a question. So, so there's a lot of talk of more and more advanced AI, but do you think there are any dangers in developing more and more intelligent artificial intelligence? Could it go wrong, and how could we maybe avoid it going wrong somehow?
Well, I always one thing I always say is good news. You know, all of those narratives about our robotic overlords that are controlling and killing us, it won't happen. That right after I talked about killing systems. Yeah, good news. Bad news. You know, we are already controlled by these systems. So in terms of what can go wrong, I think a lot has gone wrong, and we need to counteract it at this point. You know, just the way that decisions about who gets a loan are being made by AI-based systems that are highly biased, for example. Their AI is consistently involved in making decisions about people's lives, and they are highly, highly biased. So I think the part of the worst case scenario has already happened. We're already living the consequences of AI gone wrong. And many people also would argue, of course, that the 2008 financial crisis was an algorithm gone wrong, ultimately, that nobody understood anymore. So we're already there, not in the sense of being ruled by robotic overlords, but at the same time, our lives already being regulated by these intelligences. So I think we're already a little bit over that. We have to really work very hard on counteracting what has already gone wrong.
There was one more comment. Salome, would you like to ask yourself? It was just, yeah, no, it was like this nice comment about this academic language, about dry academic language and AI. So how much actually we humans should maybe produce more text, how to engage and make more human created texts. Okay.
Yeah, coming back to that, I think, I mean, humans have done a lot of creative text. This was very much based on the data set that we fed it, which was, you know, Whitney biennials and Liverpool biennials. And we learned a lot about the language that we as curators use. Yeah. So the AI also, interestingly, if you take a closer look at the project, can become extremely politically correct, which is, I mean, wonderful to see, but it starts gendering every space, and it really reveals our curatorial agendas and aspirations. So if we had fed it a different types of much more creative text, we also wouldn't have run into those problems. The same we're facing here, we are talking within this conference in a certain kind of, you know, academic language surrounding a certain kind of field. So we always run into those issues, and we have to be aware of them.
Okay, thank you. My last comment is about, I really like that you said these many variations of how this artificial intelligence is writing these curatorial texts. But because variations can be really like, I don't know how many, but many, many, many. So at some point, Do you believe this AI curator could make suddenly really like a genius text, like surprising us?
Well, honestly, the genius text will always be based on what that AI has learned from us. And what I see as the problem is that you would need an AI that really has a full sensorium, and is able to see art, to experience art, to feel art on site, to come up with suggestions and a curatorial agenda that exceeds ours. One fact here is, of course, also that all of these AIs, GANs in particular, that I have shown, they are trained not physically on the paintings, although there are experiments with that too, but images of them. So it is already a level of mediation that this is based upon. So personally, at this point in time, at least, unless we construct much more sophisticated AIs, I find AI much more interesting in what we are learning about ourselves, what makes us human, what constitutes the human sensorium and human intelligence, and how we coexist with AI in different states. So really learning about each other, to me, is the more interesting part than having hopes for AIs blowing my mind because they write the text, compose the music, or curate the show that we never ever could have imagined. We are pretty good at what we're doing also in many levels. Why do we aim for replacing our own capacities rather than expanding into a very different type of thinking or perception?
Okay, thank you, Christiane. This was very great for closing this session, because I think this now we can leave with this session with thinking about our sensorium and also this relation to the intelligence, like you were mentioning also in your talk. And also we will have some also other AI panels also over the next coming days. Mm-hmm. So we will be happy to continue with this very interesting, rich discussion started now. Okay, thank you very much, Christiane. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the invite and for the great questions, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for questions. And those who are, we can now finish, and those who are Riga based, we all run